So for our final discussion, let's consider women in ministry in the Episcopal Church. One of the key elements here is the emergence of women's rights as a concept after the Civil War. The effect of extending voting rights to African Americans in the Reconstruction context was that this was only extended to men. And so women begin to argue for the full voting rights for themselves. So there's a clear link here between the abolitionist movement and the suffragist movement. A religious argument is seen as especially crucial because biblical interpretations of the role of women was done by men to limit the activity of women in both religious and political spheres, especially the narrative around Eve and the story of the fall. And so let's take a little close look at Amelia Jenks Bloomer, an Episcopalian writer in the late 19th century, and her text, Alas, Poor Adam. This is from a PDF, and it's the concluding paragraph of that PDF I posted for you on Populi. She writes, "But my friends, the passages we've been reviewing have nothing whatever to do with the question of women's suffrage. Nothing to do with her talking and acting outside the church. Search the Bible through and can find nothing against her sharing in political affairs or enjoying political rights. They relate only to the church and to the church of other times. Let women set her heart at rest on this point and cease to feel that God created her an inferior and subject, and that she must not claim her rights and hope to better her condition in this life. That condition has been steadily improving since the introduction of Christianity, and the end is not yet." So Bloomer is doing a couple of interesting things here. One is she's saying that biblical interpretation can only really limit the women's role in church life. But the Bible does not speak to civil life, to American civil society in the full way. And so even if Christian interpretation might hinder the full participation of women in the life of the church, it does not hinder their full participation as citizens in the American Republic. But she also ends with a notion that Christianity introduces a gradual progress throughout history, and so perhaps at some future point, women might have a full say in the life of the church also. We'll get there. A very important dynamic in the life of the Episcopal Church for women is the emergence of sisterhoods. We can note the beginning of this for the Episcopal Church in the year 1852, when Anne Ayres organizes the Sisterhood of the Holy Communion at the Church of the Holy Communion in the city of New York. This is the parish of the rector William Augustus Muhlenberg, who he and his son will be very influential in the 19th century for the Episcopal Church. Now, this sisterhood was not a religious order per se, but rather involved women making commitments of 3 years to be part of a collective society and to engage in service-focused work, especially in the area of nursing. So these sisterhoods are actually essential to the professionalization of nursing in the 19th century. The model is brought by William Augustus Muhlenberg from German Lutheran context, where there were nursing deacons operating in the life of that church. And so sisters serve as nurses at the new St. Luke's Hospital in New York City at this time, and they help provide the template for the emergence of the nursing profession in the U.S. And this emergence of sisterhood into specific practical vocational work helps move women into professional church work over the next several decades. Another important element is the recovery of the Catholic tradition by the Tractarian movements, and this leads to a revival of monastic orders in England. For the United States, this all comes to fruition in 1865, when the Harriett Starr canon establishes the community of St. Mary as a monastic order. It combines prayer and service, especially in areas of nursing and education. And she helps retrieve the monastic daily offices, the wearing of habits, and monastic vows. And all of this leads to a strong reaction from evangelicals who are greatly opposed to this move. Harriett Starr Cannon and her Order of the Community of St. Mary are invited to Memphis in the early 1870s to help revive the Diocese of Tennessee in the post-Civil War context. In 1878, there's a yellow fever outbreak in Memphis. And members of the Community of St. Mary give of themselves fully towards their work of caring for the sick. And several of them die. And they become known as the Memphis Martyrs. And their death is written up and eulogized and is used as a way to help gain acceptance for these religious orders in the Episcopal Church and for seeing the importance of the role of women in ministry in general, this kind of church work that's emerging alongside the male ministerial order. By 1900, there are 23 different monastic orders or sisterhoods that oversee 87 separate ministries in the life of the Episcopal Church. And the work of these women in these orders and sisterhoods is a primary means by which many members of lower classes and disadvantaged groups get exposed to the Episcopal Church and enter it. So they are really key for evangelism and mission on so many levels. And parallel with the sisterhood movement is the deaconess movement. And this is another way in which women's ministry in the church begins to become professionalized. In 1857, Adeline Blanchard Tyler and 5 other women are quote-unquote set apart as deaconesses by Bishop Whittingham of Maryland. Now, this is not an ordination. The language is set apart, not ordained, but they're set apart as deaconesses and given a commission for church work. These deaconesses have no liturgical function. They don't read the gospel. They don't read the prayers of the people. They don't help set the altar. Rather, they work for the poor and the sick. They are religious educators, they're teachers, and they're involved in a variety of reform movements. Now, there are significant fears that deaconesses were a backdoor for introducing more Roman Catholic-style orders into the life of the church. And so the proposal to approve deaconesses fails at several different general conventions. But in 1889, General Convention does approve the category of deaconess with the following amendments. First, candidates have to be unmarried women. So there's an assumption that a woman can either serve her family or God, but not both. And then candidates need testimonials from 2 priests and 12 lay people. Of those 12, 6 have to be other women. That is a very high burden of proof to put onto women, asking for 14 different testimonials. And then bishops had complete authority over all forms of their ecclesiastical discipline. But with this approval, the deaconess movement spreads throughout the 19th century, and they work in a whole variety of social contexts. They oversee healthcare, education, orphanages, and become very involved in missionary work, both domestically and overseas. There are some significant areas of training for deaconesses across the Episcopal Church. St. Margaret's House in Berkeley, California, Wyndham House in New York City, the Bishop Tuttle Training School in Raleigh, North Carolina, and Bishop Tuttle Training School is for African American women. So there are African American deaconesses. By 1930, there are 222 deaconesses in the Episcopal Church. But as women move into other segments of U.S. workforce, and as there's increasing spaces for women to do other kinds of church work, to be directors of religious education, to begin teaching in seminaries, and as some women begin to look towards the possibility of ordination as priests, by 1960, there are only 86 deaconesses. So there's this declining role for deaconesses for a couple of other reasons. Women gained suffrage in 1920, so there are many other venues for them to be present in American society. And colonization processes begin to slow down, and colonies win their independence. And so women don't have the foreign mission field to go to anymore as a place for their work. So as these mission opportunities decrease and social services become professionalized, like the nursing profession or social work or teaching, women go into those roles. There are increasing opportunities for professional church work as Christian educators in parishes and dioceses as well. So the role of women is going to be shifting as we move further and further into the 20th century. And the question will be, will women be permitted into the same orders of ministry as men? That will be a significant point of focus for us as we move into the second half of the 20th century. That's all for this week. I hope this has given you a lot to think about orders of ministry, forms of ministry, who has access, what kind of structures exist that sustain different groups of ministry in the life of the Episcopal Church. I look forward to our conversations.